We are the current philanthropy chairs with Theta Chi fraternity, and we are proud to have created this event with the help of our entire brotherhood.
The issue of mental illness and stigmatization is held dear in our hearts. In this country, approximately 1 in 4 adults suffers from a diagnosable mental illness. However, nearly every person is affected in some way by a mental illness, whether it be a family members, or friends, or their own. Our fraternity and the Tufts community is by no means an exception.
Despite this situation, mental illness is severely stigmatized. Many patients with mental illness are dismissed, delegitimized, and mistreated for an ailment seated in the brain rather than another part of the body. Countless sufferers feel unable to seek help for fear of judgment.
Yet, just as the medical and science community has come to a full understanding of other diseases, from common viruses to cancer, enormous progress is currently being made towards the understanding of mental illness from medical, biological, and psychological standpoints. Now, more and more resources exist to help patients from mental disorders. For example, we are proud to be on a campus that features some effective student-led mental health initiatives, such as Active Minds and Years to Peers.
Although much remains to be learned, sufferers of any illness deserve the basic rights of respect and fair treatment. So tonight we ask, what is being done about this unjust stigmatization in our community? Mental health is addressed from several fields: biology, psychology, clinical therapy, psychiatry, and activism, to name a few. We are extremely grateful to have our 5 panelists representing these fields from Tufts Harvard Medical School and McLean Hospital, the #1 ranked psychiatric hospital in the country.
Just to introduce our panelists. Dr. Lisa Shin is a Tufts professor of psychology and the principal investigator of the Tufts Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Neuroimaging Laboratory. She has published in several esteemed journals with research on brain function and cognitive processing in patients with anxiety disorder, especially PTSD. Dr. Shin's research also covers neuromechanisms behind emotional processing. Lisa Sangermano is a psychology major and a member of the Tufts class of 2016. She is also the co-president of the Tufts Active Minds and works as a writing fellow with the Tufts Entertainment Board. Lisa is interested in educating and empowering the Tufts campus to improve attitudes toward mental health and also the biological foundation of mental disorders. Dr. Marilyn Downs is the director of outreach at the Tufts Counseling and Mental Health Service and an adjunct professor at the Boston University School of Social Work. She has over 25 years of clinical therapy experience, and she has published in several health-related journals. Dr. Downs' research topics have included suicide prevention, health seeking, peer effects on mental health, and clinical supervision.
Dr. Christopher Cowan is the director of the Integrative Neurobiology Laboratory at McLean Hospital and associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He has also done research for the Simons Foundation Autism Research Initiative and the Fragile X Research Foundation. Dr. Cowan has published in several prestigious scholarly journals, including Science and Nature. His research has primarily focused on the genes, proteins, and mechanisms behind brain development under healthy and pathological conditions, such as depression, anxiety, addiction, and autism. And last but not least, Dr. Joseph Coyle is the Chief Scientific Officer at McLean Hospital and the Eben S. Draper Chair of Psychiatry and Neuroscience at Harvard Medical School. He is also the Editor-in-Chief of the Psychiatry Journal of the American Medical Association and past President of the Society for Neuroscience. Dr. Coyle has received over 20 prestigious awards and honors for his research, which has been cited over 35,000 times. Specifically, his work is focused on the pathophysiology of psychiatric disorders with an emphasis on schizophrenia. The panelists will now provide further introductions to their work, followed by some questions from Christian and I. Then we'll open up to the audience questions for the remainder of the discussion. Dr. Shin, would you like to start?
So just to clarify, what exactly would you like me to say in terms of introduction to my work? How many minutes?
Just 2 to 3 minutes if possible.
Okay. I've been at Tufts since 1998. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Massachusetts General Hospital where I conducted neuroimaging studies of anxiety disorders with Scott Rausch, my mentor. That's a little bit in the way of background. So I'm interested in brain structure and function in people with anxiety disorders and how that relates to cognition and symptoms. And so that's basically what I've been studying in a nutshell. We're doing right now, we're trying to address questions like what areas of the brain function abnormally in post-traumatic stress disorder and where these abnormalities come from. Are these abnormalities an acquired characteristic of the disorder, or are these abnormalities something that was pre-existing, like a familial risk factor, basically, that's pre-existing that makes someone more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder after a traumatic event. So we're asking questions about the origin of these brain abnormalities and PTSD. We're also asking questions about whether we can use neuroimaging techniques, so measurements of brain function, to actually predict response to treatment. So if a person has a particular brain scan pattern of activation, does that tell us anything as far as whether they'll respond well to cognitive behavioral therapy? And we're doing that kind of research right now. That's a very broad overview. Hopefully that's okay.
So my name is Lisa Santamato, and like Ben said, I'm a sophomore here at Tufts, and I'm the co-president of Active Minds. So Active Minds is a really awesome organization that was founded about a decade ago at UPenn. And a student at UPenn, her brother, who was also in college at the time, committed suicide, and she realized that there needed to be something to be done about the way that we have conversations about mental health on college campuses. Actually, most mental illnesses arise from the ages of 18 to 24, which is during college years. So it's a really important time to be aware of how mental illness can affect us and how we can be affected by things like stress. So Active Minds now operates at over 425 chapters around the country, including at Tufts. The goals of Active Minds are to increase education and awareness in college students about what mental illnesses are, what are the symptoms, how you can help people that you, like friends of yours that you think might be dealing with mental illness, and also how to take care of yourself and recognize if you yourself are going through a difficult time and how to seek help. So our goal is just, like I said, to increase awareness, and so we're coming at this from more of an activist standpoint as opposed to some of the more scientific angles that you'll hear from today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Marilyn Downs. I'm the Director of Outreach here at the Tufts Counseling and Mental Health Service. I may have met you before, you may have seen me speak before, or probably a lot of you have gotten an email invitation from me recently to participate in the Healthy Mind Survey, which I'm the principal investigator of here at Tufts. My role is primarily clinical. I also oversee our outreach activities and some of our research activities within the counseling service, and do some clinical supervision as well. I also do some research outside of Tufts, specifically focusing on, I guess, the topics that we're talking about tonight, specifically stigma as it affects help seeking in a college student population. I have focused mostly on college students who are experiencing suicidal thoughts. So that's been sort of my research interest. I've also worked here at Tufts. We had a large grant a few years ago that was specifically on suicide prevention. So we've really worked on sort of taking current research and applying it in outreach activities here in order to advance those efforts in particular. So, and I also teach at EU, as was mentioned.
My name is Chris Cowan. As was mentioned, I'm an associate professor at Harvard Medical School and director of the Integrative Neurobiology Lab, which basically comprises about 10 trainees, postdoc students, and full-time researchers. I came to this point in my career through starting at an undergraduate liberal arts background at Wesleyan University, much like I imagine what you experience here at Tufts, and which is really my first exposure to research. We began by studying brain mechanisms involved in aggressive behavior in rodents, and I became very fascinated with complex animal biology and behavior, but I realized that it was an exceedingly complex process to understand when you're trying to unravel this billion piece puzzle. I then went to the opposite extreme by going to graduate school at Baylor College of Medicine, where I got a Ph.D. in cell and molecular biology and biochemistry, and it really sort of has grounded the way I look at research by thinking about the way the brain works at the level of individual molecules and how they interact and the kinetics of those interactions. I then did my postdoc at Harvard Medical School, where I really started looking at signaling mechanisms involved in neuron development and neuron function, and became very excited about trying to move back up the ladder toward complex behavior. I then started my own laboratory about 10 years ago now at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School. And it was really at this opportunity that I began to think about mental illness as an endpoint of the research program. It was really somewhat off my radar screen, I must confess. I've always had a long-standing interest in brain development, but I think as we'll probably touch on today, I think if there's anything that's really evolved over the last several decades is convergence of molecules and functions in brain development and how those increase the risk and susceptibility to mental illness. And there's a real important interplay there to be dissected and understood as we try to go forward with treating mental illnesses. My research program is really focused largely on drug addiction, which again, we know that age, adolescence is a really vulnerable time, and we're very interested in understanding how drugs of abuse change the brain function. So that's a big part of the lab. The other, as Eben mentioned, is understanding mechanisms involved in autism, and this is, as you all know, a very fast-growing area, both from the standpoint of human health, but also it's a really exploding area of research. This is clearly a neurodevelopmental process, and we're trying to understand the genes and molecules involved in that.
Excuse me, I'm Joe Coyle. Like Chris, I went to a liberal arts college, Holy Cross out there in Worcester, and was a French and philosophy major. But there were a lot of physicians in my family, and so I figured I'd probably take up the trade. Did my sciences in summer school. I was a little uncertain about what I was going to pursue. In my summer after my junior year, I got a summer job as an orderly in a psychiatric ward in our community hospital. And one day, my best friend from grade school's brother, who I played with all the time, was brought in with his first psychotic episode as he developed schizophrenia. And it struck me as a terrifying epistemologic problem, because he was hearing voices and experiencing thoughts that he believed were quite real, but in fact were generated because of the disease in his brain. Anyway, that got me engaged in psychiatry. But at that time, I'm a little older than the rest of the people here, psychiatry was dominated by psychoanalysis. I went to Hopkins and just by chance got involved in basic brain research after a 3-year postdoc with Julie Axelrod, who just happened to win a Nobel Prize while I was with him. That was a trip. I had nothing to do with it, of course. Came back, did my training in psychiatry, and opened my laboratory, focusing on how neurons communicate with each other. At the same time, my first job was the job I really wanted, which was running a schizophrenia outpatient clinic. Nobody wanted it because they were not amenable to psychotherapy. And that was the exciting aspect of psychiatry, psychoanalysis at the time. Anyway, at that time, we began to understand how antipsychotic drugs work. They block dopamine receptors. And it was thought, Miss Ebenese, that we found the cause of schizophrenia. And I did everything to optimize the treatment of those patients with antipsychotics. And I was very good at treating psychosis. But each week when I had my clinic, I would be confronted by people who were still profoundly disabled, who were estranged from their families, often homeless. And so it was clear we didn't have the cure. We didn't have a clue. And I did not get involved in research on schizophrenia until almost 2 decades later, until we started to get some findings that we could get traction with. Anyway, scrolling forward, I've been working on the potential or the role of the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, glutamate, which is directly involved in learning and memory, and one receptor mediates neuronal plasticity, and through a variety of lines of evidence, it looks like this system is a primarily malfunctional system in the disorder. And the good news about that is if we understand that, then we have the hope of developing treatments that don't just treat a certain symptom, but actually treat the fundamental cause of the disorder. So that's what I do.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to move on to some more general questions that we were hoping everyone could kind of provide an answer for from their own perspective. So I guess if we could go down the line starting with Dr. Shin. The first question is, what in your opinion is the #1 reason why someone might not seek treatment for his or her mental health disorder? And how does your work try to combat this?
Well, I think there are probably many reasons. I'm not sure what the #1 reason is. I think stigma is a huge reason that people might not want to seek treatment because they're embarrassed, or maybe they don't know where to go for help. So that's a huge one. There are others, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will talk about others as well, and maybe even talk about stigma. And I think that how will we combat this? Well, each of us will do what we do and try to understand the biological basis, I think, of mental illness, and I think that's one way. Knowledge, increasing knowledge about the biological basis of mental disorders is one way to help combat stigma. I wish I were a social psychologist because I could talk a lot more about stigma and how to avoid it and how to teach people to not treat people in a stigmatizing way. But I will say that knowledge about the biological basis of psychopathology is, in my view, a huge way to start combating stigma.
The stigma that surrounds mental illness is probably the #1 reason why somebody wouldn't seek treatment. And from my standpoint, the way to combat that, I think, definitely what Dr. Shin said, but also more like of a general, just have people be more aware of what mental illnesses are, and the fact that these are things that are real. They are very serious and can be really severe. They manifest themselves in different ways. It's not like every single person with bipolar disorder is like the character from Silver Linings Playbook. Like, it's not a cookie cutter sort of thing. So by increasing the awareness surrounding these disorders, we can create a safer space so that if you do feel that you need to seek treatment, you can feel comfortable in doing so and feel supported by those around you.
Well, I'll answer it maybe in a slightly different way by saying a little bit about, I think, what we know about why people do seek help, which is generally getting help for mental health or health-related concerns is thought to be a sort of a complicated and multi-step process. So if you think about, for example, you get up in the morning and you feel really lousy, you have a headache, or maybe you have a little bit of a temperature, you probably, the first thing you do is not go to the doctor, right? Maybe you take something to feel a little better, maybe you sleep a little bit longer, you wait it out, that kind of thing. So there has to be this process with mental health concern where somebody experiences a problem and then they actually label it a mental health problem, if you will, right? And when you think about how we from day to day go through our ups and downs, we don't necessarily think about those as being mental health problems. So there has to be an internal discernment process. Then somebody has to decide, and I need help for this. And that is actually a very complicated step. Perceiving the need for help is one of the largest predictors of actually getting help. Yes, stigma is in there, and we'll talk a little bit more about Tufts later. But if you take a campus like Tufts, there's a very low rate of stigma about mental illness and help seeking here on this campus. We've measured it in our surveys. But that doesn't necessarily mean that even with that everybody who has those ideas gets help. So people also have to think how treatment is going to be effective. They have to know how to access it, as Lisa mentioned. And they have to think it's worth the time spent. So there's a lot of different things that go into that. So maybe I'll just leave it there. I'm sure we'll be coming back to it later.
I'm certainly no expert in this area, and I'll just make a few brief comments, which is unusual for me. you know, I think a lot of the reasons, like I said, I'm no expert in this, but I know that I've had friends who've struggled with mental illnesses, and they feel like, you know, you're weak if you seek out treatment. They fear the side effects of prevalent treatments, which are there, and I think that's something that it's you know, while we certainly encourage people to seek treatment when you have problems, I mean, it is something that in psychiatry and the research field is a real problem that we try to struggle with, is to try to get better treatments that don't have side effects, and because some of them can be really quite debilitating. People are afraid of how it's going to impact their careers and their jobs, and, you know, all the kinds of things that, you know, the obvious things. And the one thing that I personally have tried to do with my friends who have had these issues is just try to be supportive and try to encourage them to seek help. Try to give them a feeling that somebody understands, and that it is okay to talk to someone about these problems, and I think that that's true with almost anything we could talk about in life. Is, you know, what can you do? Well, you know, you're just one person, but you have to vote with your feet, right? You have to do, you have to act on your conviction of what you think is the right thing to do. And I think if you do that, you represent an example to your peers and your colleagues and friends. And I think on a campus like this, it's great because this can be somewhat of a protected environment. When you leave this and get out into the workforce, there may not be quite that same support network and understanding. So, you know, over time, you know, society changes, and I think we're moving in that direction. And just by talking about it and being aware of it, I think is a big part of the process.
So I'd like to talk about a couple other reasons why people don't seek treatment aside from stigma. Stigma is huge, and I think it's huge when it comes to mood disorders and anxiety disorders, which are less impairing than your cognition. But in psychotic disorders like manic depressive illness and schizophrenia, people can have, suffering from them, those disorders can have very little insight that they really got a problem. It's a struggle, and it's a recurrent struggle with families. That's why they often get alienated from their families, because they tend not to continue in treatment because of the lack of comprehension that they have a disorder. But with persistence, often the corner can be turned, and the patients can then own their illness and take responsibility for it. So like any other physical illness, you got diabetes, you got hypertension, unless you own that illness and say, I'm going to deal with it, you're going to lose. And it's the same way with these severe mental illnesses. The other issue, I think, that interferes with seeking treatment in the other area is substance abuse. And that's where peers can have a tremendous amount of effect by repeatedly pointing out how this is interfering with the individual's life. But we talk about drugs hijacking the brain, and it can really interfere with choices. And it's often only after hitting a particularly rough spot and getting feedback from loved ones and peers that individuals can turn the corner. And I should point out that you are now at that point in life when this is a real issue, be it drugs or alcohol. So you need to be vigilant and listen to what your friends tell you if you're getting in trouble.
So in the interest of time, we're going to move to questions specifically directed to the panelists. This question is directed to Dr. Coyle, and anyone else who would like to chime in is welcome to. Seeing that the treatment of mental health disorders is extremely complex, how does one discern what is the right type of treatment for our patients, either medicinally or through therapy, and where is the line drawn for each, and how do you pair them two together?
Well, I think the first thing that we've learned is that all our treatments ultimately work by affecting the brain, and that these disorders are brain disorders. Now, I don't want to sound like a roaring reductionist, but the evidence is pretty compelling that psychological interventions change the brain, and pharmacologic interventions change the brain. Now, where we've, I think, made real progress, and this is how we shape our decisions on how to treat individuals with a particular disorder, is clinical trials that involve placebo-controlled studies to demonstrate efficacy in specific disorders. And so it's not sort of a grab bag thing. There are evidence-based approaches for specific disorders and how you treat them. And if this doesn't work, you go to Plan B. What is Plan B, et cetera. The second thing is these evidence-based approaches also include psychological interventions. And the third thing I'd emphasize that in most of what we've conditions that we've studied, it is a combination of pharmacologic treatment, antidepressants for depression, antipsychotics for schizophrenia, and a psychological intervention that not only boosts efficacy but also prolongs the efficacy of treatment, and associated with much fewer relapses and better outcomes. So, 20 years ago, there was a war between those who believed in psychology and those who believed in pharmacology. The war has been is over. Neither is completely right, and neither is completely wrong. But the combination is probably often the best approach. And the choices are based upon evidence-based studies of what works with individuals with what disorders.
Okay, the next question is going to be for Dr. Cowan. So, given that the ability to study genetics in the laboratory is becoming increasingly accessible, how do you believe this can alter public perception of mental disorders, take into account things like inheritance of mental disorders and susceptibility? And also, what might be some drawbacks to discovering the genetics behind mental disease?
This is a great question. You sent us a list of potential questions, and I really did sort of gravitate to this one. First of all, the power of genetics in animals is incredible. We can manipulate the genes in any way you can imagine. We can control the timing of the gene changes. We control the subtypes of cells within the body in which we can manipulate those genes. We can take identified mutations in humans and put them in mice or in rats or in monkeys, and we can say, how does this affect their complex behavior? How does this affect their susceptibility to stress-induced depression-like behavior? How does this affect their addictive potential? So I think this is, to me, one of the most exciting parts about modern neuropsychiatric research, and one of the reasons why I really just jumped on this field about 10 years ago was because I could see that the future of understanding the brain and mental illness, that this is where it lies. But I think in how it affects public perception, I think one of the most important things that will help in combating stigma and in moving this field forward is the realization that, if you're a drug addict, it's not just because you're a weak person, that comorbidity between different comorbidity, meaning like depression and addiction, tend to be found together. Different types of mental illnesses often can cluster together. That there is a biological basis to this, that in some ways this is not that much different than getting cancer. This is not that much different than getting diabetes. And I think this is making a profound difference, I think, in our society, and a message that I echo loudly, which is that there's a reason why somebody, once they become addicted, why they keep relapsing and they spend half their life in prison back and forth through this cycle. It's because the brain has changed, and that there is a fundamental circuit rewiring that is, and we are fundamentally under, under control, or we're controlled in some ways by the way our brain is wired and rewired in certain experiences. I think that the drawback part, which is really intriguing, if you sort of think about the ethical part of this, right? It's not going to be long. Right now, I think it costs something like $10,000 to have your genome sequenced, and they're trying to get it down to 1,000 or less. This is going to be like having a PKU test on your heel when you're born. Every one of us will get our blood taken, and within a matter of hours have our entire genetic makeup. And you will know you have a 36% risk for developing schizophrenia. You will have a 23% risk of developing Alzheimer's. You will have, and so this creates a real ethical dilemma. And I think it's something that you guys and we are all going to have to struggle with. How much information do we want to know? And what do we do with that information? I mean, I as a scientist find that I want to know, and if I were in those shoes, I would want to know the information, just because I feel like it gives you more power to understand perhaps certain behaviors you might try to avoid, right? If you know you have a high susceptibility for diabetes, well, you might want to go easy on the sugars in your lifetime, right? You might want to have some real strict dietary controls. If you know that you have inherited 6 of the top genes that are risk factors for addiction, when you go to, when you're in college, you might want to kind of try to avoid some of those parties where you're going to get offered and exposed to those kinds of things. But this will be an ethical debate, whether we should have that information and what we should do with that. So I think that that's the negative side of all this, understanding the genetics, is really trying to grapple with the ethics of it.
Could I make just 2 comments briefly? Just to add on to what Chris is saying, but the thing about most of the evidence about the genetics of psychiatric disorders is that it's complex genetics, which are multiple genes of modest effect interacting with environment that produce the phenotype. And it's like diabetes, it's like height, it's not like brown hair and blue eyes. So there is no gene that we know of that causes schizophrenia. There's an aggregate of genes interacting with environment, and we think right now it looks like 128 risk genes, so that's how complicated. So it's not completely predictable. The second thing I would say is it looks like these risk genes in isolation may confer some benefits. And so if you look at creativity, for example, it seems to be loaded in families with bipolar disorder and also schizophrenia. So I get very concerned about eugenics that, we're going to find those bad genes and we're going to get rid of those fetuses that have them, or, shun those. I think that's a higher level of stigma that we're going to have to deal with, as you pointed out, with regard to thinking clearly about the ethics of this.
And this question is directed towards counseling and the dental service as a field evolved with the constant supplementation of new research findings with regards to mental health.
I hear your voice, but I don't see you. Where are you? There you are. Okay, I can answer that question, but I have a lot more to say about the first 2 questions. How do you feel about that? I'm sorry, there's really like a therapist question.
You can answer
take
all
the therapist out of her office, but you can't do it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Well, I'll say very briefly that science, such as what we're talking about, has a constant influence on what we're doing. And when we're talking about how our clients, say, understand the condition that they have, when I'm having a conversation with a young person who may be presenting with a first episode of, say, a manic episode, first episode of bipolar disorder, and we're talking diagnosis for the first time, to be able to cite the research that gives information about the biological and brain basis of it, I think is enormously helpful. Partly because it's always helpful to have information about what it is you're struggling with and what the treatments are that are effective. But I also think it does remove some of that self-blame piece when you know this isn't something you did to get this. This came your way. But can I answer the first question? How about that?
Yes, I'll
Would
just
you like to
clarify
ask
for
me?
everyone.
Okay.
So what are the biggest reasons why people fail to reach out for help at Tufts and around the country? And do you believe that there are differences between Tufts and elsewhere?
Okay. And I thought I would answer this because I thought maybe people would be interested to know some of the research at Tufts, because this applies to all of you. So, you know, many of you know that we do conduct this Healthy Minds study about every 2 years. I'm going to guess a lot of you probably participated this round. And what we know is, you know, as Lisa already said, you know, and was offered in the introduction, you know, Tufts students are no different than college students across the country. At the time we did the 2012 survey, 26% of students were experiencing significant mental health problems, defined in this case as depression, significant anxiety, suicidal thoughts, or self-injurious behavior. So that's about how it is nationally. And that's a sizable number. And we also know that about 25%, about 75% of mental disorders start by the age of 24, of lifetime mental disorders. So we know it's kind of a vulnerable time, a vulnerable population. So the good news is that about half of those students in that sort of what I would call a higher risk group have got mental health services within that year of the study. So half is pretty good, actually. We're very happy to see that. But it also means half did not. Half of the students who are really struggling a lot. So I said a little bit before about factors that affect help seeking. We also asked students, why didn't you come? Why didn't you get mental health services? So let me ask you, what do you think was there sort of the number, what comes to mind for you is the #1 reason that students would say they didn't want to get help when they were having these kinds of problems? Anybody? Take a guess.
So you can walk up and use the microphones, or
just call it out if you want, maybe. Yeah.
The unknown of what would happen or what it would be like.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, what do you think?
They didn't think it was that big a deal.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Time and scheduling.
Time and scheduling, yeah. Back there?
They're embarrassed.
They're embarrassed, okay. What else? Yeah.
They don't trust therapists.
Okay. that could be true. We're kind of a shady.
They didn't know how to seek help.
Okay, yeah. I mean, those are all, yeah, back there.
They didn't say anything else really.
Understand. Is that what you were going to say?
They didn't think anyone else could relate.
Could relate, yeah, okay. Great, well, those are some of the things. The #1 reason in this age group, and this is true nationwide, is students say they'd rather solve problems by themselves. That's true in 50 to 75% of the cases. So some of it was also, I question how serious my needs are, I don't have time, I think maybe it's going to go away on its own, I don't know if it'll help, or I worry. The least common was I worry what others will think of me. And I thought I'd note that because that's a little, people often think, you know, we're talking about stigma. I think stigma is actually a really complicated, it's got a little angles to it. Embarrassment is part of it. But this idea that I should fix things myself, I think is a big part of it. So I'll leave that there.
And to add on, second question, what do you think is the most effective in getting someone to seek help with regards to mental health?
Well, I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to think about this. So some of the outreach we've done is around what is often called gatekeeper training, or training people to sort of recognize when they have a problem in themselves, and also when to reach out to other people. Like, we know that at least half of the students who come to see us say they came because somebody else encouraged them to come. It makes a huge difference. And we also ask students, how do you feel? How often has somebody said to you, how are you doing? And then how do you feel when somebody asks about that? You know, like 85% say they really like it when a friend checks in with them to say how they're doing. So these are some of the things that we've tried to work on, is to kind of break down, I know some of this kind of, I'm just kind of a private little bubble in my own self, and I don't have to look at or worry about what anybody else is doing. Because I know, you know, because I have a lot of conversations with students, that your friends and your peer group matter a lot to you, and you notice a lot about what's going on. So, you know, we think that what helps is when somebody pays attention to how somebody else is doing, when somebody actually asks, how are you? You know, you look like you're not doing so great lately. Do you want to talk about it? You know, just kind of creating a space that's non-judgmental. Like somebody else said, gently encouraging somebody to consider getting help, not pushing them. I think if you've gotten some help yourself, and because we know, I assume, a lot of you have, or a lot of you have struggled, because we're all human, right? It's helpful to say, you know what, I've gone to see somebody, I've been through something like that. It's not, when we're talking about mental illness or mental health problems, that's not about them. It's about us, right? We all have a mental health status, and we all have the possibility of encountering major mental health problems. And I think the more that we talk about that, and you know, stigma tends to live and breathe in secrecy. So the more that we have conversations that are open, I think, and just forthright, the more it seems like, oh yeah, okay, that's just what people go through.
This next question is for Lisa. How specifically has Active Minds addressed the issue of mental health stigmatization, and what is the importance of a peer presence in terms of promoting mental health treatment?
Sure. So Active Minds, like I said before, is active at over 425 college campuses, and so their big goals are sort of what I mentioned before, but to increase awareness and education about different mental disorders, which means, you know, what the symptoms are, how prevalent they actually are, even though sometimes it may seem like, you know, everybody else is doing great, it's just me. But by, you know, knowing that 1 in 4 college students has a diagnosable mental illness, understanding that it's not just me, like other people are going through this, is one aspect. And then also, sort of what I said before about being able to see these things in yourself and knowing how to take care of yourself and understanding that, you know, when you need to seek help. And, you know, we work a lot with counseling services to try and provide information about these services. So students, we host a lot of discussions. Every week we've had events, like we had a film screening and discussion, we had hosted National Eating Disorder Awareness Week, or tabling about eating disorders. So these are some sort of events and stuff that we do to help get this awareness out. And there's many different ways, and these are just a few things we do. And to your second question about a peer presence, a lot of it is what Dr. Jones just talked about, you know, having somebody there for you that you can go and talk to if you're feeling down or upset or anxious, and also, you know, being able to recognize that somebody is struggling and knowing that I have a responsibility to help them. And having a mental illness is a very isolating experience, so it, you know, seems more isolating than it actually is. So having a peer presence of friends or people who are there to support you can be really, really helpful and really necessary, I think, to support somebody with mental illness. So, and I think also that's something that we as students can do, because we're not all you know, neurobiological researchers yet. Maybe we will be one day, but right now we're just college students. So something that you can do on a daily basis is, like Dr. John said, checking in with friends that, you know, maybe you think are struggling or, you know, have been struggling in the past. Just asking people how their day was, seeing, you know, making sure that everyone around you, including yourself, is doing okay. It's really important.
Okay. And this question is for Dr. Shin. How do you believe that patients of mental illness contribute to the public perception of mental disorders, taking into account their participation in research? And also, how can treatments for mental disorders change public perception of these diseases? And then how are we learning more about the effectiveness of these treatments?
Okay. So I think the first question you were asking about participation in research and how that could affect public perception. So I've been working with patients in research settings for quite some time, 20 years now. And I feel that, and I've seen evidence of two effects of that. So when patients participate in research, of course, yes, they're participating in the collection of knowledge about a particular condition, right? So that, I think, does a lot of good for, as I said before, you know, gathering information about the biological basis of mental illness and destigmatizing it. But also, I think what goes maybe undiscussed is how research participation actually helps individuals who participate. So I have found, and maybe there's a bias, right? Maybe I'm only seeing the people who agree to participate, and maybe I'm not seeing the reactions of people who don't agree. But of the people who do agree to participate, I see a lot of motivation. I see a lot of wanting to help, wanting to give back, wanting to help other people with similar conditions, a sense of solidarity. Actually, one of the most motivated groups that I've ever worked with has been a group of women who were abused sexually as children. So these are adult women who had childhood sexual abuse histories and they had PTSD. And they were one of the most motivated groups of people I've ever worked with. They were amazing. And they were very committed to the cause of trying to find out more about the biological basis of PTSD. So I think that there is a benefit to participation in research, not only a benefit to generalizable knowledge in science, but also, in a lot of cases, a benefit to the people who actually participate. And the other question you asked was how treatments for mental disorders can change public perception of the diseases, and how we're learning more about the effectiveness of the treatments. I think in general, I think most people probably have the same feeling that if a particular condition is treatable and shown to be treatable, then it tends to be sort of less of a quote death sentence type diagnosis, right? Something that's more manageable. And I think more research can contribute to finding better, more effective treatments. And using biological measures could probably help focus, as was mentioned before, help focus some of the treatments on particular mechanisms, right, to really attack those mechanisms and get to the heart of the matter and improve treatment response in general. I think also that some biological treatments may be in some ways less stigmatizing. I thought it was interesting that some of the biological techniques that people use are actually associated with decreased perceptions of stigma. So more in terms of using techniques like functional neuroimaging. Now this is not a treatment, but I thought it was interesting that using biological measures can actually be associated with reduced perception of stigma. So Judy Illes at Stanford has done some research, and she did a survey, and she asked patients and clinicians about the use of biological measures, including fMRI. And patients and clinicians said that using these biological measures actually made patients think that that their family members would better be able to understand their condition, and that stigma would be reduced, and that they would feel less guilty and less self-blame about their own condition as a result of that. So I think that understanding, again, coming back to this point of understanding the biological basis can really help decrease stigmatization.
Great, thank you. All right, so at this point we're going to move on to questions from the audience. So I guess we're going to go back to the podium and call on anyone who has a question. Okay, yes.
My question is for Dr. Downs. What are some specific actions that counseling and mental health services has done at Tufts that you feel have been successful and are a good example for other communities?
Do you mean in terms of
in terms
our service overall, or
in terms specifically of stigma?
Well, I mean, I think we have tried to translate what we understand about what the components of stigma are. Like we've been using the word a lot here, but it actually has a lot of little subparticles to it, that have to do with problem perception and perception of getting help. So we've tried to kind of translate those, I think, into messages, if you will, when we do outreach, when we give talks, and the materials that we present. And I think trying to reach as many parts of the campus community as we can. Kind of emphasizing the positive aspects of asking for help, getting counseling, normalizing it, making it not seem like something mysterious. It does look like our efforts have been helpful in the sense that since we've been doing this, tracking these particular strategies, we've noticed a change in attitudes that we measure, and we've also noticed more students coming in to see us, and we think those are probably good indicators. So it's modest, but we try. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
So this is more directed towards Dr. Shin, Cowan, and Coyle. It goes a little bit beyond the specific sort of confines of stigmatization, but a lot of your work is dealing with the biological basis for certain mental conditions. To what extent do you believe that human behavior is determined by biological factors?
Nobody wants to touch this one. 1 minute or less. I mean, I think Dr. Coyle said it earlier. Actually, maybe all of us said it in different ways earlier. But I think that it's really an interaction between biology and environment. I think that biology is not necessarily destiny, and I think a lot of different studies and a lot of different parts of psychology have shown that environment can have a big impact actually on biology. The environment can actually change how genes are expressed. I'll let you guys talk about that. You're the experts on that. So I don't think we should, and I'm sorry if we made it come across that biology is destiny.
Absolutely not. No.
Yeah, not at all.
So, as I said, I don't want to sound like a radical reductionist, but I do think it all ultimately plays out at the level of the brain. However, experience has an immense effect. So when we're talking about the biology, we're not necessarily talking about the genetics. The genetics determines your future. The environment has a huge effect. Lisa studies women that are abused in childhood, and that just ramps up the risk for major depression, for substance abuse, a whole host of things. Genetics can bend that curve a little bit, but I think the next chapter that's going to be written is epigenetics, and that is how environment changes how our genes work in the brain, with the rest of our body, but in the brain. And there's hints now that experiences through epigenetic mechanisms can be transferred to the next generation. And epigenetics is not where you change the sequence, the DNA sequence. You're not making mutations. You're just silencing genes or unsilencing genes, and that can be transferred. So I was just at the AAAS meeting, and there was a very troubling paper about social class and life outcome, and how social class, low social class, can have adverse effects on general health, mental health, and that can persist from generation to generation. So I think lurking there, epigenetics may be very, very important, and make us, I think, realize how salient environment is, especially in developmental time periods.
If I could answer quickly, it's an extremely complex interplay. If you think about all the different factors that weigh into this, I mean, it's true environment plays a huge role, and environment is interacting with the underlying neurobiological structure, but in some ways the neurobiological structure, which is what Joe was kind of referring to also, is influencing how you will respond to that environmental experience, and how that will lead to adaptations that may be good or bad for the long term. But there are certainly many cases where the genes are, I mean, you have Fragile X syndrome. If you have a deletion of the Fragile X gene and you're a male, you will have an IQ of 70 plus or minus 10. You will have enlarged gonads. You will have motor stereotypies. I mean, there are fundamental processes. There are certain genes that are, so I guess what I'm trying to say is some genes are more important and are sort of, if you think about the key scaffold to how the brain is working. Other genes are more maybe in the modulating aspect of things. And you know, if you think about sort of the evolution of you know, gene mutations across species and across, you know, human life, you know, those that are a little less critical for basic function can allow for a little more give in mutations that can tolerate those. But perhaps those kinds of genes may not be critical for basic brain function, but your brain is not well equipped to handle extreme stress conditions or something like this, right? So this gets really complicated. But and quickly about the epigenetics, it's interesting. This was really hot a few years ago, and still is kind of a developing idea. And this is how the so your genetic code is your A, G, T, C, and then the amino acids and the proteins, the blueprint of your genes. The epigenetics are other molecules that are made through the same system, but basically come down and wrap up that part of the DNA and keep it from being expressed, or open it up and let it be expressed more. So this is what epigenetics is. It's a change in your gene expression without changing the primary code. But in addiction, interestingly, about 50% of the risk for addiction is genetic. And the key epigenetic experiment you want to do, which we have all done, is what you call cross-fostering. So this would be, you have parents with, you have a parent with addiction, the offspring has a much higher probability of becoming addicted later in life. And we have plenty of examples of cross-fostering. Cross-fostering is where you take the offspring from one parent and that's raised in another, right? So that's like orphans, right? I mean, or orphans,
Adoptees.
Adopted kids, right? Sorry. If you look, if you look at the risk for addiction in adopted kids, their risk factor is determined by their genetics, not by their family. So kids coming from families, this as a population average, of course, but coming from non-addicted families, raised in a family with an addict, their risk of becoming addicted is the same as if they were raised in a non-addicted family, it's the same as the general population. Similarly, if you're born from an addict parent and you grow up in a family of non-addicts, you are at an elevated risk for addiction. So that is genetics, right? That can't be epigenetics in my opinion. And also, in some ways you could argue, is also not exclusively environment.
Thank you very much. So my question is more directed at Dr. Downs. Anyone can feel free to jump in. So from my personal observation, speaking with friends who've been in and out of group therapy, one of the things that I've noticed is that one of the biggest places where you can get stigmatization is in group therapy, either people feeling judged or judging others themselves. And I'm wondering, what are some ways maybe that we as a community or that health professionals can kind of tackle this issue?
Well, that's an interesting point. I guess I'm a little surprised. I mean, I hear you, but I guess I think about the power of the group is often actually to do the opposite of that. So if you think about, we'll take it outside of Tufts for a moment, but if you talk about, people that, like I used to run a young adults group for people that had schizophrenia, for example. So being in a group like that with other people who really get what you're struggling with, and where it feels normalized, often actually has the opposite effect. But that doesn't mean you couldn't be in a group where there's negative judgment happening. I would hope that if it's run by a professional, that they're helping with that, they're actually addressing that in some way. Because I think that's one of the values of the group is a sense of shared condition, shared experience, right? Don't you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know if that really answered your question. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
My question is more about, well, it's like a comment. Well, it's like a question. I'm wondering about accessibility to treatment in general, because it seems to me that we've been talking about ways to treat and how therapy helps, et cetera, and so forth, or battling stigma, but even when you pass all those hurdles, then there comes the question of accessibility. Therapy without insurance is upwards of hundreds of dollars. A lot of people don't have access to that. Even with insurance, like you have to pay a copay sometimes. So it's very hard to get access to it. I'm just wondering if you can comment on that or like talk about ways around that, I guess.
You're talking to me?
I would assume probably, but I just want to talk about it.
Everybody can just wanted to check. Well, it's one of the things that's really nice about being on a college campus, which is that, you know, all the services here are free for undergraduates and easy to get to and pretty easy to access. Doesn't mean they're limitless, as many of you know. Yeah, it's a real issue. I mean, and depending on what part of where you are and what part of the population you're talking about, we don't have universal health care. A lot of people don't, you know, I guess there's improvements, but a lot of people still don't have adequate health care or don't have adequate access to services like in rural communities or certainly certain urban communities. And, you know, it's been sort of a fight to bring the awareness of the need for mental health care, you know, to the same level as it is for healthcare in general. I think there have been some advances in this regard in terms of policy changes, but we have a long way to go. You know, there's still a general prioritization of physical health care as though they're separate, right, from mental health care. So I guess I'm just agreeing with you about that. I mean, that I think is a broad-based policy and kind of political issue that requires and deserves ongoing advocacy. But anybody else have?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment because this really gets me going. Because I've been in psychiatry for 40 years, and you all are just coming into a situation that was the consequences of the most draconian managed care system that was a two-tier system that just wiped out beds, wiped out the availability of treatment, demonized, trivialized mental illness and substance abuse. One of the most striking statistics for me is that if you looked at the number of people in beds for treatment from the 1950 to the current time, the number per thousand remains constant. In 1950, about 80% of them were in psychiatric hospitals getting treatment. Now, it might not have been great treatment. We didn't know that much then, but people recognized they had mental illness. Now, 80% are in prison beds. And if you go into the prisons, you'll find that it is rampant with substance abuse and mental illness. Probably 50% of the prisoners are in there because of those two reasons. So I think it's outrageous, and this is something that young people can get up in arms about and do something about, that the services are not available for the average people, that government has allowed the mental health service system to be devastated. And hopefully with ACA and the elimination of the distinctions between medical disorders and psychiatric disorders, this thing might start turning around. But it's a disaster.
Thank you.
So I'm sure we all have a physicist friend who groans every time it's a sci-fi movie, or a computer science person who just smacks their head every time they see someone typing in an action film. In recent movies, there have been a ton of movies that sort of focus or have ancillary characters that have mental health issues, most famously Stroke Lines Notebook, but even films like Shutter Island, Limitless, which was more about a hypothetical drug, but really was about like pulling yourself out of the tough state. So I was wondering, as mental health professionals, as people who are deeply invested in sort of science, do you think that the depiction of mental health issues and treatment in the media and movies specifically is helpful, hurtful towards stigmatization, towards treatment? And what would you like to see if you don't think that's a good depiction at the moment? Anyone of you?
Well,
we think you have something to say.
I think generally it's been pretty helpful. I mean, it's a long ways from the Snake Pit and movies like that. I thought A Beautiful Mind was epistemologically well done. Now, schizophrenics don't have visual hallucinations by and large; they have auditory hallucinations. But what it demonstrated was how real those experiences were for that person, and how we couldn't figure out, is it me or is it really going on out there? I think the movie about the guy with manic depressive illness. Yeah, I thought that was really well done. I thought it did a great job of showing how it affects families. I remember the father's interaction with the son, and how terrifying and demoralizing and real it is. So I think those, and he kind of came out at the end doing better. So I think those are helpful. They don't, I'm sure there's bad ways to depict it, but it's not as demeaning as it used to be.
From my perspective, I mean, I watch, I watch some of the same shows you guys watch. I was just watching Homeland a couple of nights ago. I don't know if I'm sure you've probably all seen that. If you haven't, you should. It's an outstanding show. But in the penultimate, or maybe it was the final episode, one of the main characters has a breakdown and finally decides to undergo electroconvulsive shock therapy. And her boss, who, throughout this series is, this all-knowing, guy, and he's in there basically, don't do this, don't let them do this to you, and what this is going to erase your memory, and these are not true. ECT is done while you're anesthetized and with muscle relaxants, and you're no longer biting a stick in a straitjacket and shaking violently. It's a medical procedure that's very, very safe and very effective. It's probably the most effective antidepressant treatment out there. And memory loss, it's a short-term memory loss on the order of like 30 minutes. Most people recover very, very nicely. But anyway, so I see these kinds of things, and it bothers me because we can't help but see those kinds of shows, and I think it puts fear, as I was mentioning earlier, this idea about people are afraid to get treatment because they're afraid of side effects and they're afraid of the treatment itself, and some of that is blown out of control, blown out of proportion in popular media. The other thought that I also watch American Horror Story or whatever it is. And there was a whole season, right, about, I guess it was in the 50s or 60s, but about the people in straitjackets and all the things that, and because we see this now, people watching these shows don't really realize that isn't how it works anymore. And I think that sometimes does more harm than good. It makes a good horror thing, right? It's creepy and scary to see, but sometimes I think it's bad for society, and at least trying to remove stigma for seeking treatment.
More that mental health problems and treatment are depicted in a way that is relatable to us, where you can feel like that could be me. I get where that person's coming from, and I understand what that would feel like, or what the better we are. It's what we don't. But that doesn't sell as much. But you want to, what you don't see is that the person at the supermarket next to you, who looks just like somebody that you want to have a nice conversation with, they actually maybe has a serious mental health problem. But you don't know that, because you assume that somebody who has a serious mental health problem. I know this from the grad students. I'm teaching adult psychopathology. They're going to be clinicians. And they're realizing they think that somebody with schizophrenia always is disheveled and shuffling on the street and smells bad. And that is just not accurate, and so we just need more depictions that actually are accurate, I think. But I think we've made progress.
If you've ever seen the movie Canvas, have you seen that movie? It was actually premiered at Tufts a few years ago with Joey Pantoliano and a couple other actors. Marsha Day Harden, I think, was in it. And it was actually, so the director / writer, this was basically his story about his family. His mom was schizophrenic. And I think that movie was actually very well done. And we premiered it, we showed it here on campus because it was so well done. So there are really good depictions out there. And fortunately, we are long past One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I really hope that people just stop watching that type of movie and start watching the good depictions like Canvas.
I'll just add two, just so we can all talk. Representation is very important, not just for mental illness, but for everything, gender, sexual orientation, race. But I think it's really important for people with a mental illness, to see somebody like them on the screen who's, you know, having like a life and, you know, experiencing things and, you know, understand like this is, you know, I can see myself in this person. I think a really great example is if any of you watch Community, the character Eben displays a lot of symptoms of an autism spectrum disorder, but one great thing about Eben is that he still has friends that are really supportive to him. He still is, you know, he struggles with his family and his symptoms, and he struggles in a lot of social situations, but he's shown to be like a legitimate person with personality traits and not just a stereotype. I think it's you know, depictions like that that are really important.
Thank you very much.
Hi, this is more a Tufts specific question, but so given that you have discussions asking what do you think are the biggest barriers for people to go and seek help, one of them was the consequences of actually seeking help. So I just, if you don't mind, could you walk through like who makes decisions when you think you are having a mental problem, or like who is the decision maker? Because there's a conflict between whether you know what's best for you and whether a specialist knows what's best for you, because the decision still impacts you as a person. And I'm bringing this in context because I've recently heard of a story from Yale where students are actually asked to take leave of absence against their will. So yeah, if you could just address with this issue, I think people will be interested in the audience.
So are you? I want to make sure I understand. Are you saying like if a student comes into the mental health service and we're maybe evaluating them, or they've begun treatment, like who makes decisions about what happens from there? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
The student. I mean, 99.9% of the time, and I would say, I know I'm biased, but I do think we have a really good staff, and the people are really actually very kind, and it's very student-centered. And I think most college mental health services are like this. It's very oriented to why are you there, how can I be helpful to you, what do you think is the difficulty, let's talk about how to address that. It's very, very rare at Tufts for a student to be asked to leave against their will. I mean, it might happen a couple of times a year. My guess is if you understood the situation, you might also decide. That's not decided by us, by the way, it's decided by the deans. And in those situations, it would be somebody that is deemed to be at a very, very high risk for hurting themselves, is the most likely thing. I don't mean a single suicide attempt or even a hospitalization, by the way, because I know that's hit the news. Some campuses get hospitalized, you automatically go home. We don't do that. We just don't do that. We want people to come in. We want people to get treatment. We want them to be well and stay at school as much as they can. And people have a right to do that even when they're not in great shape, to be honest. I think that's kind of a human rights issue. When it tips over to we think they may be really at risk if they stay, that's when they sometimes get sent home. But it doesn't happen very often. Does that answer?
Yeah, it does, because I think it's important to know, like, what if you wanted to seek help, what is the consequence behind that? What if,
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think people worry if I tell her, like, a student comes to see me, I'll do an evaluation, and I'll ask about suicidal thoughts, and I'll ask about drug use, and I'll ask about various things. I always make it very clear, nothing you tell me is going to get you in trouble, first of all, So illegal activities, drug use, etc. There are no consequences of telling me that. I'm a clinician, it's confidential. And in terms of any risk factors, usually we're just going to work on kind of stabilizing the person, helping them understand it, and helping them feel better. That's usually how that goes.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that answers that.
I was wondering if any of you could comment on any stigma that may exist within the professional field. I know I've heard that there's some stigma around certain disorders, like borderline personality disorder, for example, that's highly controversial and might turn off some professionals from working with clients or working with patients with certain disorders. So if you just comment on anything you know about that.
Well, I think the evidence is pretty clear that borderline personality disorder is a disorder, and therefore individuals who are suffering from borderline personality disorder deserve access to care. Not to blow McLean's horn, but they have a major program. You know, I think like any area of medicine, speaking broadly, people sort of self-select for what type of patients and disorders they like to work with. And I like working with schizophrenic patients because I admired them so much in terms of the challenges they faced and how they dealt with it. There's other areas that I was much less interested in. There are a group of clinicians that are quite dedicated to dealing with the disorder, like borderline personality disorder. We now have evidence-based approaches for treatment, and I think the outcomes are looking much better.
I mean, there's probably, I mean, I don't know any evidence about this, but I would imagine that an employer who suspects that you have any kind of mental illness is probably, I mean, that's working against you. Wouldn't you agree? So, I mean, within the professional world, this is something that is a problem. And again, it comes back to the stigma, it comes back to a lack of understanding. It also comes back to a lack of flexibility about what the model and the mold of an employee is. And you know, I have a friend who suffers, he's a scientist, and he suffers from occasionally bipolar disorder, and he has basically been fired from several positions over the years because of, you know, things related to this. And you'd think if anyone would understand, it would be a research community who studies the brain. But there's a certain, I think there is a bit of an intolerance, and we're afraid of what we don't understand, and it can, you know, create disruptions in the workforce, and you got to avoid that at all costs. And so I feel like we're also, as a society, and this is just my personal opinion, but we're still sort of struggling with how to bring all this into the fold, right? By we're talking about this, we're making this more aware, we're trying to reduce the stigma, but that can't be where it ends, right? We have to also figure out how do we really deal with this in a functional way that gives everyone a fair shot. And I was just actually, I'm kind of embarrassed. I've been studying autism for a while now, and I was speaking to someone last week in my office who has a friend who's a leader of an organization in Massachusetts who is really against people like me, people studying brain mechanisms of autism, because they view autism as a gift. It should not be viewed as anything wrong with this individual. It's just part of the spectrum of behavior, and that you shouldn't be trying to figure out what causes it, because there's nothing wrong with it. And you know, it really gave me pause, because you know, I can see for high-functioning autistics individuals, sure, I totally see that. But mostly what I see are parents saying, my child is unable to function in society, in their class, in their families. We need help. This is a problem. They have emotional outbursts, they have all these kinds of problems. And so where do we find it? You know, I sat in my office for a long time thinking about that afterwards, and I thought, you know, if I were a parent of a high-functioning kid with autism, and I felt like, you know, why is society putting this balloon over them and setting them aside, and why can't we try to create space for all of that within the spectrum of behaviors to work? And I think I don't have an answer for this, and if anybody does, I'd love to hear it, but I think it's a dialogue that we need to have. How do we incorporate mental illness and neurodevelopmental disorders in a way that gives everybody a full quality of life, that gives everybody a fair shot in a free society? I guess that's all we can really ask for, right?
So, like someone previously mentioned, a lot of people are worried that seeking help causes financial burdens to their family, or maybe some people might worry that seeking help is actually seeking attention. So, what do you think is the best way to address stigma surrounding patients who actually go into counseling but make very little progress over a long period of time? And how do you think this issue or this problem could be solved?
you want to know how to solve the issue of somebody being in therapy for a long time and not making progress. Is that what you're saying? I felt like there was maybe another part to that.
I think it's more of like how do you destigmatize or explain the differences between individuals. Like some people might go into counseling and be married a few months later, and some people might stay in it for years and not make progress. And I feel like there's a stigma surrounding people who don't get better like people expect.
Like among their friends or their family or that kind of thing. Well, that's a really good point. I know I'll have to say I have a lot of conversations with the clients that I see about who else in their lives they're talking to about what they're going through, because I actually feel like it's often a really important part of getting better is finding places where you get support for what you're experiencing among the people that you love and that love you, friends, family, etc. But it can be, and sometimes that involves giving people language for what to tell people. Some things are treated quickly, and other things require very long-term care, or in some cases, lifelong care of some kind. It really depends on the condition. We've been talking about schizophrenia. That requires lifelong intervention. Somebody with a history of child sexual abuse, often very long-term intervention, not always. But other people, maybe anxiety, depression, other kinds of adjustment issues, these might be more circumscribed. So I think maybe giving the client, giving the person, the individual some language for what to tell people, how to understand it, how to explain that not everything is just is fixed in just a handful of sessions. And it's not always just tell me what to do and it'll get better. It's often a lot more complicated than that. Is that sort of getting at what you're talking about?
Yeah, and is there something, for example, like disorders such as depression or anxiety, where if for a long period of time it doesn't subside, that there are certain steps taken to perhaps alter the form of counseling or
definitely
change it or help?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say often with depression and anxiety, we would probably start with therapy and therapeutic interventions without medication, depending on the severity of the condition. Somebody who's really, really depressed or anxious is going to benefit from medication probably pretty quickly, I think. But other people might not want that, or they might want to start with therapy. Somebody very depressed who's tried therapy and who's tried medication and continues to be really not functioning might benefit from ECT, for example. So there can be different things that are tried. There's a lot of different interventions to try, and not one thing works for everybody, because depression is actually it's a rather diverse condition in terms of the way people experience it. So different kind of interventions will work well for some people and not for others.
Well, just remember, Woody Allen's been in psychoanalysis for 55 years. You know Woody Allen?
We'll talk about that more in Psych 1 in the next couple of weeks, actually. I know you're in my Psych 1 class. So.
Thank you.
Not Woody Allen, treatment.
Actually, if I could also add to the end of that, I think it's also really important that I think a lot of us don't realize that treatments for mental illnesses are not it's not like an antibiotic that fixes your bacterial infection. You got to try a bunch of different things, and it's really frustrating for patients because why can't you solve this? And sometimes there is intractable depression that nothing seems to work for. And I think just a plug for research, and as future taxpayers, this is why it's critical that we invest in research, because I think it's through research that we're going to be able to better understand why certain patients respond and others don't, and what are some alternative, what is it about those individuals that makes them resistant to the treatment. If we can identify those things, maybe eventually we get to the point where we'll be like an antibiotic, fixing a problem.
This is mostly just to satisfy my curiosity on the topic. And this is sort of based on the assumption that more prevalent mental health issues among college campus kids are things like depression and anxiety and things like that. It's also based on the assumption that, as you mentioned before, one of the biggest reasons why college students don't come forward regarding mental health issues is because they feel that they can deal with it on their own. And in those cases, I'd assume that those students sort of are nowhere near the point in their mental state where they need to be put on medication for anything. Mentally related. My question is more towards, for those that do overcome the stigma and do come forward to deal with their mental issues, mental health issues, sorry. Is there any notable difference in efficacy of treatment, be it general therapy versus being put on medication? Have you guys, those of you that have worked with patients in the past, have you noticed an increase in efficacy of treatment when it's assisted with medication for those that do come forward?
Well, I think this got addressed a little bit. I would say that at the counseling service, our starting point is always going to be therapy first. That's where people start. It's usually where students want to start, not always. And we never kind of push medication because it's usually a process where people have to get there. And sometimes, like I was seeing a student recently who had like an enormous amount of anxiety, and I actually suggested medicine fairly early. And she didn't want to do that, and that's fine. And actually 8 weeks later, we've tried a whole bunch of interventions, and she's doing really well. She's made a lot of progress. So we keep that conversation about medication on the table, explain a little bit about how it could help her, because I think they can partner very well together with something like anxiety, because it can bring your arousal level down to a state where you can actually sort of be a little more functional and do some things, and that actually starts to have a nice positive feedback loop. So that you start to feel calmer and more competent and that kind of thing. So I think they often partner well together. I'll state my personal bias would be, I don't think medication alone for depression and anxiety. I usually think some kind of psychosocial intervention, some kind of psychological intervention is good. Sometimes people want to be able to just take medicine and have that do everything. I don't think sometimes that might be the case for people, but I think more often they can really benefit from some therapy. I don't know what other people think about that.
Oh, I completely agree. So I come at it from a perspective of working in a mental hospital where people self-select, come to us, and then they failed the plan A and plan B. So for them, a pharmacologic intervention coupled with psychological intervention is the most effective. But I completely agree with Dr. Downs that for young people in college, it's typically a combination of moderate depression and anxiety. Yeah. There's a very high co-association of those two in your age group. And psychological interventions are often very, very helpful, and if that doesn't work, then you talk about, well, maybe we need to add on a medication.
So in the interest of time, this is going to be our final question. Unfortunately, we pretty much run out of time, so.
I have 1.5 questions for Dr. Downs. The bigger question is basically, how can we moderate what the effects of other people's drug abuse has on patients' access to medications? Like, for example, I'm ADD, and getting medication is really difficult because I can't get it through Tufts Mental Health Services. I have friends who, her parents didn't allow her to be diagnosed at home, so she got diagnosed when she got to college. Yeah. And she has to take a 2-hour bus ride to another hospital in order to get medication when she needs a prescription filled. And I understand the need for that. Like, it's a stimulants are highly abused drugs. Yeah. But it's kind of screwing us over, frankly.
Well, maybe I'll just say something, and I don't know if this is clarifying or maybe, but just in terms of the ADD medication in particular. So, because it is a widely abused substance, a few years ago we put in place, students can get prescribed ADHD stimulant medication through our psychiatry services if they've had psychological testing, where they have a diagnosis of ADHD, or if they have a history of childhood testing and treatment, that's all. So if they have either of those things, some are evidence where they've had prior treatment and a history of treatment that's beneficial, and or they've gotten recent testing, they can totally be seen by us. So it's not, and we actually prescribe a fair amount of stimulant medication. But somebody can't just sort of self-diagnose saying, I feel like I'm having a problem paying attention and I want to get stimulant medication. That we don't do.
Yeah, of course.
There are people that are closer than, and I don't know what kind of health insurance she has, maybe that's an issue.
Yeah.
There are people closer that we do refer to who are a little more willing, I guess, to just do an office exam and prescribe stimulant medication. But, you know, if you feel, or if anybody feels like they're unhappy or they're feeling like there's something they need and they want to have a conversation, just come to us. We can talk about it, figure it out, see if there's something more we can do that would be helpful.
Okay. And then, sorry, my small question is, well, it's not really a super small question, but obviously the structure of institutions and education can either perpetuate mental illnesses or a lack of flexibility to make the feasibility of access to treatments and resources not really less desirable, or less than desirable, yeah. So I was wondering if you had some insights into what Tufts can do better.
In terms of access to mental health resources?
Yeah, for example, like in terms of like how we're structured basically. Like if, like with large intro courses, the structure of those are fairly inflexible. Like you have set assignments that everybody does by a certain date. And if something happens where you are, like something happens at home or you're going through a period of like depression, anxiety, and you can't really work, it's not the easiest thing to work around.
Oh, that's a great question. And actually, we work with students a lot around that. And you may have observations about that too. I'll just say on our end, it's common for students who are maybe struggling with something personal or mental health related issues to of course it's going to affect your academic work, right? And usually, first of all, we often say talk to the professor because really often they're willing to be quite flexible, I think. I mean, some are more flexible than others, so we can't tell them what to do. But also, we usually encourage you to go to your alpha dean, and they'll advocate for you. So if I'm seeing somebody, I'm like, I'm seeing so-and-so, student A, and I'll call Dean Herbert up and say, I'm sending her your way. She's having some trouble. She needs a little help negotiating deadlines for her classes. Can you help her out? They will. They'll help you out. They'll advocate, right?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, the sooner you can let your professors know that there's an issue, the better, right? So if you kind of try to ignore the issue and ignore it, and then you wait till the day before the final exam, it's harder for everyone to deal with that. So if you see something, you know, coming along, you think that you're going to have trouble meeting your next deadline or the rest of the deadlines in the semester, you really just, all you need to do is sit down with the professor and just talk with them, go to their office hours. That's what they're for. And they're generally speaking, my colleagues that I'm aware of are very understanding about that sort of thing.
Yeah, I was talking more about like sort of general issues. Like for example, if somebody like probably has ADD but hasn't had a psychoeducational evaluation or hasn't had a neuropsychological evaluation, or maybe they have like some issue with their insurance won't cover those evaluations and it's not feasible. And so like without those, if they're ADD, they can't get assistance through the Office of Accessibility.
Oh, so for extra time on tests and things like that. Yeah, I guess that would be an issue because they do require documentation of a disability, including ADHD and other things as well. So that is true. Although I don't know how.
Although not only ADHD, so it can be other things. If somebody has an anxiety disorder or depression, they're struggling with something like that. So, you know, again, I would say, you know, it depends a little bit case by case, but it's always worth coming in, say, talking to somebody and asking if there's some way to get some help or some support or some flexibility to see what options there are, you know. I guess I would encourage those steps anyway.
I was more thinking like what can Tufts do better, like in terms of like just generally not just like sort of general things that you found to be correlated with like these kinds of issues, if that makes sense.
Do better in terms of?
In terms of like maybe flexibility, or in terms of just like, I know in high school, a huge issue is standardization, like issues with like standardized tests and things, causing people, like special education programs in public schools aren't always great, that kind of thing.
Right.
Like, is there anything like that at Tufts that Tufts can do better?
That's a good question. I mean, it's a little bit less my science, a little bit more the academic side, I guess, but what do you think?
I mean, that's a really huge question, actually. There are probably many, many things that Tufts can do better. But one that you mentioned already, so really don't need to say it again because you already mentioned it, but this whole idea of needing documentation, and that sometimes it's difficult to get the documentation and it costs money to get the documentation, and I don't know a lot about that. I used to be on the Learning Differences Committee. Haven't been on it in a few years, but that did come up a few times, and I think that does need to be addressed. How can someone get a neuropsych or whatever evaluation to support the the disability, to allow the person to get extra time on tests and things like that when they don't have the money to do that. I don't know what the status of that. I would have to speak to people in the Learning Differences office, whatever they call it now, to find out what the status is, but it sounds like not much has been changed. So that would be a big thing to work on. Sorry. Thank you.
Sorry, we pretty much run out of time. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and let's have a round of applause for our panelists.
So this semester, Theta Chi is striving to make as big difference as possible for the cause of mental health awareness. On this Friday, we will be hosting Tufts Best Dance Crew, a dance competition where 10 of the top teams at Tufts will compete for the title of the Tufts Best Dance Crew. And 100% of all proceeds and ticket sales will be donated to the Brain and Behavior Foundation, which provides Neuroscience grants to researchers of mental illness across the globe, including those at Tufts.
We hope to make a difference by raising awareness through tonight's panel, and also by raising monetary support for continued breakthroughs in the understanding of mental illness, such as those made by our panels. Tufts Best Dance Crew tickets are available at the Campus Center and on TuftsTickets.com, and we hope to see you all there. We give a sincere thanks to our panelists for their insightful contributions, and thank you all for coming out tonight.